Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Sir with Saving for College. On behalf of the whole team here, I'd like to welcome you to today's 529 Day in Saving for College webinar presented by the T. Rowe Price College Savings Plan. Joined today by Roger Young. He's a Thought Leadership Director with T. Rowe Price. He's become a bit of a staple here with our webinar series. It's become quite a tradition to have Roger on our 529 Day webinar. And it's a very special day today because it's actually May 29th. The schedule hasn't worked out so well in the past few years. But we're able to celebrate 529 Day all together. Have a really packed program for you all today. I do want to take just a moment to thank our presenting sponsor, the T. Rowe Price College Savings Plan, for making it possible to have this free webinar for you all. For over 20 years, the T. Rowe Price College Savings Plan has been helping families save for college and other qualified education expenses in a tax-advantaged way. This 529 plan offers a variety of professionally managed investment options designed to address different time horizons and investment strategies. The plan also offers online tools and insights from T. Rowe Price certified financial planners so that families can develop their college savings strategies and be more confident about providing for their children's higher education needs. So we're going to start off here today by going through some of the most common questions about 529 plans. Do feel free to use that Q&A function here in Zoom to ask any questions that you have as we go through the program, and we'll also make sure to leave some time at the end for additional questions that you folks have. I do want to remind you also that this webinar is being recorded, so we will be able to share that with you after the webinar here today. And so if you miss anything, please don't worry about that. So let's get right into it. Roger, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. And so we're in a really interesting time right now, actually. We're going through what they call a congressional budget process. And so we have a bill passed in the House right now, still to be determined what happens in the Senate. But there are some really significant implications here for families that are trying to think about saving for college, with a really significant overhaul of the federal student loan programs, especially related to like Parent Plus loans and the unsubsidized programs. And I think it's fair to say at this point that there's almost no chance of any kind of a blanket student loan forgiveness in the next few years, right? So Roger, let's start kind of with this high level question of how does that kind of impact the families who are thinking about, putting together their funding plan today?
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. Happy 529 Day to everyone. And yes, it is very, very interesting times. A lot going on with the Department of Education. I would say if you take a step back, we've always advocated that people should limit their loans and limit them, if possible, to the federal student loans. We've always said, hey, forgiveness would be a nice to have, but you shouldn't be, making your strategy around that. So I'd say people don't need to completely rethink how they're saving for college and their plans for college. Certainly some things are going to change. We're hearing lots of big changes potentially for international students, possibly changes to eligibility for Pell Grants, but it all points to, take things into your own control and save an appropriate amount relative to your goals and relative to your situation. We always say you don't want to be in a position where you have high income and low savings heading into the college years. So a couple of more specific thoughts. I think even after all this dust settles, there's still going to be some income-driven repayment plans with the federal loans, possibly some paths to forgiveness. Again, not blanket like was the hope for a lot of people. There will probably continue to be ways to defer or get forbearance if you have trouble repaying your student loans. But people right now need to, assess whether they're in default and get going on repaying. So again, the key is really save an appropriate amount, make sure that you're doing what you have in your control and not relying on, federal programs that might change.
Yeah, that's really sound advice, Roger. And I appreciate us kind of starting with that because I'm sure families are, a little bit concerned about, what the future holds, a lot of uncertainty, especially about what's going to happen. And so I think that, this messaging of taking control is really kind of key. And, fortunately, we have a fantastic vehicle in 529 plans that provide tax benefits and allow us to really take control of our college funding strategy. So Roger, do you think you could kind of, this is the first meat and potatoes question, right? Of breaking down the tax benefits at the federal and state level that really make 529 plans so attractive for so many families. And I will try to get my screen set up here so I can find the Q&A box, which I've now lost, but I just want to make sure that we can get everybody's Q&A here going. But tax benefits, Roger, take it away.
Sure. And I think in contrast to the last question about all of the issues with, loan forgiveness and all of that with the Department of Education, if anything, the benefits of 529s have kept getting better. And that includes some of the tax related aspects. So the big benefit of a 529 plan from a federal tax perspective, federal income tax, is that any growth of your 529 plan assets is tax deferred along the way. And importantly, withdrawals for qualified educational expenses are tax free. Now, you don't get an upfront deduction for federal taxes, but probably a lot of people on the call are familiar with saving for retirement with a Roth type of account, where again, you don't get the benefit upfront, but you get the benefit of tax-free withdrawals later. They're somewhat similar, very similar, in fact, in terms of the tax treatment from a federal perspective. You get that tax benefit later, but it's a big tax benefit. Other thing to consider is the state taxes. So most states have income taxes. A lot of states offer additional benefits, and they do, in a lot of cases, offer tax deductions upfront for contributions up to a certain limit. Okay. A lot of states require that you do it by contributing to that state-sponsored plan. Some will offer what we call tax parity, meaning you can use any plan. You definitely want to look into the state benefits specific to your own state when you're considering a 529, because they can differ. What they consider qualified expenses can differ. So a lot of things to consider, but potentially a significant benefit from a tax side.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's really the core, right, of why people use the 529 plans is to be able to save money on taxes, right? Because every dollar that you're able to save on taxes, that's another dollar that you're able to use for the education that you don't have to borrow, right, for student loans, which is really important.
Mhm.
So, Roger, as we're trying to think about how much we need to save for college, if I were to project out tuition for a private university 18 years from now and look at that sticker price, I may faint because it's probably gonna shock me a little bit if I'm a parent looking at that, right? And I might see a number like $500,000, and there's no chance I'm going to be able to save that. But you've done a lot of work and research kind of on this specific question of how much do you need to save for college to put your child in a good position. And I'd love to kind of share actually an article you recently published, and I've got some screenshots here that I've ripped off of you that we'd love to share with the folks about how to benchmark where you are in your college savings.
Sure, sounds good. And not ripped off. We gave permission. Happy to share those with the audience. So first, I will preface all of this by saying, it's very much an individualized type of benchmark, and it really depends on your family's priorities. But let me set a couple of starting points in terms of assumptions we're going to use. So, for example, on average, roughly half of what gets spent on college, or half of what funds college for students in America, is the parents' saving and income. Okay. And then the other half is a variety of things, grants and scholarships, loans, gifts from relatives, work during school, work study, things along that line. So if we start with that baseline of, okay, maybe aim to fund half of it. Some people will say aim to fund a third. Some people might say higher. It's up to you. But we thought a half was a rough estimate to use, and a good kind of down payment on college, if you will. If you're aiming to cover that half and you're looking at an in-state school, you're looking, public school, and you're looking to include room and board, fairly common set of circumstances for a lot of people in America, then we've said that if you save around $260 per month from the birth of your child through college, not just to college, but through college, that, gives you a pretty good chance of meeting that objective of funding half. Okay. And so that includes assumptions like 6% assumed return on your investments, which is not guaranteed, but it's an assumption. We're also including a 5% college inflation assumption, which, maybe lately seems conservative, but, hard to say. So that's one way of looking at it. Another is the benchmarks that you've put up here, which says, okay, well, how do I get to that saving for half? And you can see both the graph and the numbers by age. And this is with that assumption of I'm aiming for half. Okay. So you see one of the examples here is age 10. Okay. It's time to get serious about saving for college. My student is entering middle school. You have a little bit more sense of their aptitude, their interests, where they might want to go to school. Then you can apply that 1.1 multiple. So say, you have a college that you're thinking of that's $25,000 per year at that time, multiply that by the 1.1, your target would be around 27,500. And based on where you are relative to that, you have a sense of, okay, do I need to ramp up my contributions or am I doing okay? You can also adapt it and say, well, I actually want to completely avoid student loans for my kids. And based on that, I'm going to aim for 75% of the balance instead of 50%. So you would, 75 is 1.5 times 50. You would multiply that by 1.5. And so now you're looking at 1.65, I guess, at that age. Or you might be saying, well, I'm aiming for a private school. It costs $50,000 today. So you'd use that multiple on a different college expense. So you can customize these. Again, it's very personal, but we wanted to give a few different ways for people to look at it.
Yeah, that's awesome, Roger. I really appreciate you putting all of this together because I think it's a nice way of people to think about it. As humans, we kind of need that number to latch on to help motivate us, right? And that's totally okay. And it's really helpful to kind of see it laid out this way. And it's important as a reminder that you don't need to get to 100% of 4 years sticker price, right? Because you do have things like financial aid work study. And so that kind of brings us into our next question because this is a very common concern among parents and especially among grandparents, is the impact of financial aid. If I start saving in a 529 plan, is that going to put my child in jeopardy of getting scholarships and other financial aid opportunities? So why should folks not be so worried about that kind of a concept?
Sure. And I think it's important to acknowledge up front that there is an impact. It's not as great as people might think, and it's much less than the impact of your income. So when I said earlier, you don't want to be high income and low savings, well, that's because high income means not a whole lot of aid typically in terms of need-based aid, potentially scholarship, grant aid, scholarship that's not need-based. But in terms of the calculation that the government uses to come up with what they call the student aid index, and then the colleges tend to use that in their decision making, the assets that you have in a 529 are counted as assets of the parent. Now that is only multiplied by at most 5.64% to come up with that addition to your student aid index. And a higher student aid index means less student aid potentially. So important to think higher number is not good in this case. It's a much larger factor, as I said, to think about the income. So income can be increased by about as much as 47% of your incremental after-tax income adds to your student aid index. Okay, so it's a factor, but it's not as huge a factor as you might think. It's also important to know that withdrawals from a 529 don't count as income with the FAFSA or towards the student aid index. In contrast, we sometimes get questions, well, could I just take money out of my retirement account, a Roth account, or a tax deferred account, and potentially get some exclusion on the penalty for that? You could, but those distributions would count as income on the FAFSA. And again, that's a bigger hit. So important to realize that there's a reason we think the 529 is generally good in terms of being dedicated toward the education of your student.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if you are a higher income, higher asset person, your SAI is going to be higher, right? But on a relative basis, having these funds in the 529 plan is much more efficient, in that regard.
And actually, I see a question popping up about income of the parent and the student. Income and assets of the student can be a fairly significant effect on the calculation as well, and that can also affect a decision about, well, do I want to put money in a 529, which is a parent asset, versus an UTMA or UGMA account, which could be counted as an asset of the student and affect you more in terms of a financial aid.
Yeah, excellent. And I do want to mention also kind of the question around grandparents and also other loved ones who are saving with a 529 plan where they're the account owner, because I've seen a few questions already from like aunts and so about their opportunity to use a 529 plan. And so there used to be kind of a complication around third-party owned 529 plans where when that money was distributed to the student, it would count as the student's income under the old FAFSA rules. But with this new simplified FAFSA, any third-party financial assistance, whether it be from a grandparent, aunt or uncle, friends, or other relative, it doesn't have any impact on the financial aid formula. So actually right now, grandparents who are setting up accounts, I actually see a question just come through here from Sharon. Now is your time to shine, actually, as a grandparent or an aunt or uncle and own a 529 plan, yourself. All
Yep,
right.
very good point.
So, 529 plans, we now know that they've got tax advantages. We know that they don't make a huge impact on the financial aid. And so, okay, this is maybe a great vehicle for us to use, but I'm going to go to a website like savingforcollege.com, for example, and I'm going to find out that there are over 100 529 plans that are offered in this country. And so how do we go about choosing one of those 529 plans? And so, Roger, you'd started mentioning the concept that you take a look at what your state offers, right? I do want to, highlight a very common misconception around the idea that if you live in a particular state, you must use that particular state's 529 plan, or that you have to go to a school that's within the state. Those are misconceptions that are very common and aren't the case. There are certain 529 plans which do have residency restrictions. You can't, open that state's plan if you're not a resident, but you are able to open any 529 plan, that you desire that you're able to. And you can use it for any school, both in the United States and overseas, as long as it takes federal student financial aid from the United States government. So that's just one misconception I wanted to kind of take away. But Roger, how would you think about choosing a 529 plan if you were starting over again to save for your children?
Sure. You've hit some of the big ones, and the state tax benefit is a big one. Just personally, when you ask what would I do starting over, I actually had two different plans because my state actually didn't have a plan when my first child was born, and then we opened it up in the state after they opened one up. So it can vary depending on your situation. I think most states have them now. I do think in addition to the taxes, you do need to think about what are the investment options, the cost, the customer service, features like gifting portals. I think, your site, Mark, gives people some good insights into the nuances on those fronts. We're very proud at the T. Rowe Price in our plans that we help manage, but I thought that's enough on that. The other things that, people are asking about in terms of restrictions, the plans generally do have restrictions on lifetime contributions. I don't see too many people running into those. The restriction on what you put in a given year is largely driven by the federal gift tax exclusion. So someone can gift someone $19,000 in 2025 without triggering a gift tax return or counting against their lifetime gift and estate exclusion. So that's, again, for most people, they're not in a position to fund more than that. But if you are, a married couple can double that to 38,000. And if you really have a lot of wherewithal, you can use what's called a 5-year rule to take that 19,000 or 38,000 for a student, multiply it by 5, do 5 years worth of contributions in 1 year, and then you can't do any for the next 4 years. So I'd say for most people, those are not particularly difficult limits, and that probably doesn't affect your decision of which plan too much. Would be my take. Anything I missed there, Mark?
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean, ultimately, it is a personal decision, right? And you have a lot of options, so it's worth just kind of taking a look. Don't overthink it, but have a look and do a little bit of comparisons. We got a really great comparison tool, on our site, so just check that out, and you'll be able to get a better sense of like kind of the range of offerings, right, among the different plans. Roger, I do want to talk a little bit about the investment options because we got a question. Why are we unable to buy whatever we want from an investment standpoint, kind of like a brokerage account? I know there were some questions around like UGMA, UPMA, so maybe that's a better choice for those folks.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the investment menus that are typically available within one of the investment plans.
Sure. In terms of the why, I think it's, when Congress authorized these plans and gave them benefits, I think Congress's view was we don't want people to be day trading these accounts, right? We don't want people, treating these just like any other type of investment account. It's intended to be kind of a medium to long-term investment. So they put on a limit, and that current limit is you can make 2 investment changes per year. You can at any time you can change your mix based on what you take out or the mix of what you are contributing in, but only kind of 2 shifts from one fund to another fund. So yes, if you want more control, more flexibility, you consider yourself more of a kind of investing expert and want to do it yourself, you could think about things other than 529s. But I mean, I'm a financial professional, and I never felt particularly constrained by the limits in the 529 plans. I took advantage of the age-based portfolios. Sometimes I would dabble in the more specific funds that had just equities or just bonds or money market. But I didn't find the 2 per year particularly limiting. So again, it comes down to personal preferences, but I think there are a reasonable number of options in the 529 plans. And there's definitely something nice about an age-based portfolio that adjusts over time and becomes more conservative as you get closer to the time you need that money.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that, Roger. And there are varying investment menus among the different plans. So take a look at what's offered by the plan you're looking at. Maybe you find that one doesn't have quite the right mix of funds that you're interested in. There might be another option for you that fits your needs a little bit better. So just take a look around. So now that we kind of have some of the basic mechanics, I want to talk about some of the other expenses that we can use 529 plans for beyond tuition, right? A lot of questions typically come up around off-campus housing. I know a lot of college students love to get off campus, and living in a dorm isn't, the best thing in the world. So that's a big focal point for a lot of folks. And it's interestingly, that House bill we were talking about, it's got some provisions in there that would actually expand the use of 529 plans to kind of like certificate programs, right? Kind of like become a CFP like Roger, that you'd be able to save for something like that. So that's quite interesting. But Roger, maybe you could kind of stick with more of the basic expenses that a lot of people are thinking about, and kind of reminds them that it's a little bit more than just tuition that you can use these 529 plans for.
Yeah, room and board is really the big one. And when you look at some of the other ways you can get tax breaks on funding education, they do tend to be more limited to just tuition. So it is nice that with a 529 plan, you can pay for room and board. And you mentioned getting off campus. I have three kids. 2 of them were largely on campus. The third one, there was virtually no on-campus housing after a freshman year. So we had to deal with that. And so the question is, well, what's the limit there? It's not just what you spend there. The college will provide you with an estimate of costs for the college broken out, board, room and board separately, and you can take up to that amount out of your 529 each year and have it be a qualified expense. So the college will help you with what that number is. I will tell you in my case, the actual rent was considerably higher than that allowance, but that's another factor of life. Um, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that the potential in the proposed legislation. There's been an expansion in recent years. I think I saw a question pop up about private school, high school tuition, and yes, now K through 12 tuition is a qualified expense up to a limit. You can take out money for student loan payments, again, up to a certain limit. We'll talk in a minute. We have a slide that explains a little bit more about this new feature of rolling money from a 529 into a Roth IRA for the beneficiary, for the student. So there are a number of ways to use it. There are situations where you can use the money for study abroad, for community college, for trade programs. As you mentioned, that the certificate programs are a possibility in the future. So I would give people some comfort that there are enough ways to use it that hopefully you find some good use for it.
Yeah, and there was a question here about trade schools. So there, again, if it's one of the schools which accepts federal funding, it will qualify. Also, registered apprenticeships that are registered with the U.S. Department of Labor, any kind of expenses related to those, you could also use 529 plan funds for now. And then the other one, big one is kind of computers as well as books that are required for your attendance. Some expenses that are not considered qualified. There was a question around transportation. Under no circumstances is transportation a qualified expense. Even if you're going to school very far away, even if you're going, to study abroad, the transit between those two places is never considered a qualified expense. And the other one is health insurance. Even if it is something which is billed kind of through the school where they offer a health insurance program, not a qualified expense for 529 plans. And another question just came in around study abroad. And yes, typically it is just billed directly from your school. And so in that case, it's much the same mechanic as you would have at the university itself.
The second part of your question on the screen is about kind of how to make withdrawals from the account. And I'd say, it's not, particularly difficult to get money out of a 529 account. Typically, a plan will give you a choice of having the money come to you, the owner, the parent, or the beneficiary, the student, or in some cases directly to the college. And you can choose any of those. I would say that from my perspective, and what I did was I had the money to come to me. I liked having control, and it helped me with kind of tracking the expenses and dealing with the taxes at year end. It also helps you make sure that you're matching up those distributions with the qualified expenses. And the key point there is they need to be in the same calendar year. So one thing that can potentially trip people up is that you have a student who is you're paying for the spring semester, but the bill is due in December. So you just need to make sure that that the timing of when you pay it and when you count that on your taxes, those need to match up.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions actually around kind of the distribution. So I appreciate you kind of covering that, Roger. Folks, Roger's gone through it 3 times himself. So he's got the experience there. And it is a pretty simple process, that you can just do online at this point. So I see a lot of folks are front running me here around the question of what if my child does not go to college? Can I change the beneficiary to a different child? There was one question around, the grandparents had the 529 plan, and then they're going to transfer it to the children. Frankly, there I would just say maybe have the distribution come directly from the grandparents to the student because of that financial aid consideration we were just talking about. But Roger, maybe we can kind of break down some of these concepts around scholarships, service academies, just the idea of not going to college at all in the future,
Mhm.
and changing the beneficiaries. And then I'll cover kind of the Roth IRA provision because I know there were already some questions about that as well.
Yeah. So big picture, one thing to remember is that you don't lose the money that you put into a 529. Even if you take it out and you don't use it in any way for education, in that case, you would pay taxes on uh, the profits on the returns that you get. And in a lot of cases, you'd pay a 10% penalty on those earnings, not on the amount you put in. So obviously not what you want to do, but it's not like you lose all your money. Um, and there are a lot of ways to avoid those penalties and avoid those taxes. One big one is changing the beneficiary. And the definition of a family member who you can change the beneficiary to is pretty broad. It can even be you. If your kids are getting through college or getting through that age and didn't need all of the money, and you might pursue some sort of trade or adult education that qualifies, you can transfer it to yourself as the beneficiary. Um, the other question about scholarships or service academies, if you're in that position, obviously that's great. You can take out the money up to that amount of the scholarship, and in that case, you would pay taxes on the earnings. You would not pay the 10% penalty. So in that case, it's not really worse than if you had that money in just like a taxable brokerage account or a mutual fund that's not a retirement account. So, again, if there could be better ways to use that money, but it's not necessarily bad. Um, Other thoughts would be, and maybe when we get to this, we'll change the slide. But there's that new feature of money going from a 529 into a Roth IRA. Yep. So we got that up here. That's as of beginning of 2024, you could do this. You'll see there are several rules with this. So I want to preface this with, this is not kind of a catch-all of, oh, I'll just take care of it with this Roth rollover without any more thought to it. But it needs to go to the beneficiary who you have on the account, has to have been open for 15 years. The contributions you made into it had to have been at least 5 years ago. There's a lifetime cap of $35,000. There's an annual cap of the Roth IRA contribution limit, which is currently $7,000 for this year. And the student had to have earned income, which is a requirement of putting money into a Roth IRA as well. So a lot of caveats and rules, but I think the way I would characterize it is if you have a little bit left over and you've been saving for a long time, you can take care of it with this Roth IRA rollover in some a decent number of cases.
Yeah, it's not meant to be a loophole, folks, but it really is meant to be a nice fallback for folks who are, especially those who are too concerned about oversaving to even get started. We've really seen it kind of help that out, and hopefully it does for all of you folks, so that you can feel comfortable that there's going to be a use for these funds. I did see a question around using funds for student loans, and that's a great point. So that's a fairly recent provision where you can use 529 plan proceeds for up to $10,000 lifetime. There's a lifetime maximum there on student loan repayment. So that's also a great point, Griselle. Thank you for that one.
Mhm.
Let me just make sure here because we got a lot of questions. Yeah, so we were talking about the concept of changing the beneficiary, but what if I want to change my 529 plan itself? Is that something that I can do? There were some questions around that.
And I think the short answer is yes, you can transfer from one to another. I'm honestly less up on the mechanics of doing that, but I would just say yes, it can be done. I actually thought about that when as I mentioned, uh, my state opened up plans in the middle of my having kids, but decided it was okay for me to diversify in two different ones. But yes, you can potentially do that. Mark, are there some
The
kind of
one
key
thing
things to think about?
The one thing you have to watch is a concept called state tax recapture. And so there are a handful of states where they have a state tax benefit for their 529 plan, But if you roll those funds out of the state's 529 plan, you could be subject to, losing that deduction, having to pay back some of the state taxes. So that's just kind of a nuance where you have to take a look at your state's details. But that is, another nice feature that you can roll over your 529 plan into another, just like I think somebody said here, similar to a Roth IRA to IRA transfer, and penalties around that. No penalties as long as you transfer it within 30 days, I believe. And then of course you just have to watch that state tax recapture if you live in one of those states.
Yeah, very good point. Hey, I saw a question pop up that I thought was worth answering. Not that they all aren't worth answering, but the one question was, well, how would you compare a 529 to just putting money in a high yield savings account? And I think it's a really good question, and it gets to the point of kind of a difference between today and 3 or 4 years ago, when several years ago you earned very little money on a savings account or a money market account in terms of the interest rate. Today it's more meaningful, and you can, within a 529 account, invest it conservatively. Okay, you can, I'd say probably most 529s will offer a conservative option like a money market or a stable value or something along those lines, where you can get a decent interest rate today and have it be, pretty safe. Okay, not necessarily FDIC insured or guaranteed, but pretty safe, pretty conservative. And so then the difference between those two different approaches would be the tax benefit of those, that interest within an investment in a 529 being tax-free if used appropriately with the the qualified educational expenses down the road. So I think that's a good question. I don't want people to get confused between the type of account and types of investments, because you can have a number of different types of investments within a 529.
And I'm fairly certain every program has some sort of a capital preservation option. I want to say something like 30 do include an FDIC insured option as well,
Okay.
if that's particularly of concern for folks.
Mhm.
So there is that option. So there's really not a great argument for keeping it in a high yield savings account when you consider you're going to be paying tax on your interest every single year for that.
Yep.
So we've gotten a few repeat questions around just the changing of beneficiaries, and I totally understand. So
Mhm.
the key point there is it has to be within the family, right? And so there's a broad definition of that, but it does need to be within that same family, and you can change the beneficiary at any time you desire.
Yeah, even like a niece or a nephew would count as family there. You'd be a really nice aunt or uncle to do that. But yeah, in some cases that's the best use for it. And hopefully your brother or sister or in-laws treat you nicely afterwards.
Excellent. So Roger, this is a question that comes up a lot, and we always like to discuss it. A question of if I have multiple children, and in one example here is I have twins.
Mhm.
Do I need to open different 529 plans for them, for each of them? Can I just use one account and then change the beneficiaries like we were just discussing?
Mhm.
What's your take on that, Roger?
It's interesting. I've heard different opinions on this. I lean toward having an account per child, and there are a few reasons for that. One is for state tax benefits, as I mentioned, you typically can get a often can get a tax benefit on contributions per account or per child. And so having the multiple accounts gives you more flexibility and more ability to get that tax break. In addition, putting aside the twins for now, if you've got kids different ages, they might be appropriately in different portfolios based on their time horizon to and through college. So having their investments more tailored to their needs makes sense. I think just from a standpoint of kind of trying to treat your kids equitably, if that's a goal for you, is nice. And at some point, if your kids are filling out a a FAFSA and you're helping them and they've got to sign it and they see what your financial position looks like, including your accounts like 529s. It's nice to be able to say, yes, we earmarked this account for you and we earmarked this separate one for your brother or sister, and the numbers are different because of ages and all that. But having those separate, I think, is nice in a number of ways. Also, if something happens to you, the successor owner might not know what you had in mind. Why did Roger put that all in one child's name? Things like that. So a number of good reasons. I don't think it's particularly onerous to set up multiple accounts. I mean, yes, you could just do one account and split it up later, but then you got to change beneficiaries. I would just set them up separate.
I almost
That's
think
my
that
take.
that's more complicated administratively to try to be changing beneficiaries back and forth, especially if they're in college at the same time. It's probably just easier to have two separate accounts for them.
Yep. Even with the twins, even though they're, they might need a similar portfolio, probably still good. Yep.
So Roger, you had mentioned the unfortunate possibility of something happening to a parent or to an account owner, and there were a number of questions about what happens in that instance, especially for some of the grandparents, aunts and uncles who are saving, concerned about where that money ends up. Can you maybe share like how they can kind of control that?
Yeah, I alluded to that a moment ago that when you set up that account, you will typically have a successor owner. So it's somewhat like, with a retirement account, you set up a beneficiary. But with these accounts, the beneficiary is the student, right? The person who's going to benefit from that money for education, ideally. So instead of kind of a different beneficiary concept, it would be a successor owner. And so I'd say as long as you set that up, I'm not even sure, Mark. I'm guessing in some cases you could even have a contingent successor.
So
I
it's
haven't looked into
interesting.
that.
I don't think you can. It's actually been a request that some program
Okay.
managers have asked because it's a super rare occurrence, but it has happened where you lose both the successor owner and the account owner. And so it's kind of, yeah, it's obviously a complex situation. In that case, they go straight to probate.
Okay.
But yeah, I just wanted to kind of hammer that point home for folks. It's also really important to set up that successor owner, when you're going through that account opening process, because God knows what's going to happen to you tomorrow, so don't leave that off for another day. Make sure you just take care of that when you're opening up your 529 plan. Okay.
Yep. Good.
All right. So we covered a lot around this, I think, around the grandparents. You absolutely should be opening a 529 plan or contributing to one. In some cases, you can take a tax benefit for contributing to other folks' 529 plans. So, it's again a state-specific thing. See what's available in your state. And Roger, you talked a lot, I think, about the gift platforms that are now available becoming really popular. That's a brilliant way to increase your savings, folks, is, you share one of these links that you get from your 529 plan that creates a nice gifting page, birthdays, holidays, that's a great way to get closer to those goals we were talking about without you having to, take it out of your cash flow. Any
Yeah,
other
and
points?
yeah, sorry. Well, one other kind of nice thing about the gifting platforms is, as the person giving the gift, you don't need to know, the account number or the social security number of, the account or the student. With the gifting portals, make it easier to look up someone and get the money into the right account without, having to share kind of, sensitive information, putting that in an email or whatever. So I do think that's a nice factor. But when a grandparent is thinking about the best way to do this, again, like you mentioned earlier, there are nice things about a grandparent account that weren't the case 5 years ago, where it's very advantageous now instead of disadvantageous to have a grandparent owned 529. But, there could be situations where, because of different state benefits, where the grandparents live versus where the parents live, it might make more sense, for the money to get funneled through the parent into the parent owned plan. So just, be aware of all of kind of the tax ramifications, as well as things like, how much control do you want as a grandparent, over that money? Yeah, those are kind of the big trade-offs, kind of control, taxes, financial aid. But in a lot of cases, the grandparent-owned plan looks pretty good in a number of ways.
Excellent. And so the last question I have kind of on the slides and has come up maybe a dozen times here in the Q&A and the chat, the question around older children. And there's quite a spectrum here from I have, 8 years left to my child's going next year. And
Mhm.
Roger, this is something that you had covered in that piece that I shared with the folks in the chat pretty extensively around different kind of strategies for catching up. And none of those strategies involve taking excess risk in your investment choices, I want to remind people.
Mhm.
Roger, maybe you can kind of break down what's possible for some of the older children and whether it's worth maybe still using a 529 plan.
Yeah, and this really piggybacks on the comments I made earlier about 529s can still make sense when you're choosing a conservative investment. So along the lines of, well, okay, 529 versus a, just high yield savings account. And we said, yeah, the 529s still can make sense because of the tax benefits and you get a decent potential interest rate out of that. So similarly, if you have an older child, you would get a few benefits from doing the 529. One is, again, you're earmarking that money toward college. And, I think there's a psychological benefit that shouldn't be underestimated. I had a mentor who I'll actually be seeing tonight, who said, there was just something going through the college process and seeing that I had some money in that account, even though he's done well financially and has money in other accounts, seeing it earmarked in a 529 for education for that child just somehow makes it more palatable that you're writing these big checks for college expenses. And so I'd say don't underestimate that. And again, the ability to show that to your child that, yeah, we didn't always have the ability to do this, but we tried. We did set up this account and want you to further your education. So there's that, there's the tax benefit. And yes, having it professionally managed and doing the best you can with a relatively conservative, age appropriate type of investment, those are all positives for starting a 529 even relatively late in the game.
Awesome. All right, so let's kind of go through. We've got a bunch here in both the chat and the Q&A. There is, one question I want to jump on here. It was a question around the difference between 529 investment programs and prepaid programs, and the possibility of using them both. And so I do kind of want to cover that just a little bit. Prepaid programs aren't, all that popular anymore because there are only a handful of states which offer them. But within those states, they are quite popular, right? Because they're bigger states that have, fairly robust state university systems. And so I guess one key point I would make there around using both of them is that with the prepaid programs, typically you are saving for specific expenses. It varies between the program and what particular plan you have within that prepaid program. But you may only be saving for the tuition and fees portion, or the tuition and fees plus room and board portion. Typically, like the books, some of those other kind of expenses are not necessarily included in those prepaid programs. Any kind of an off-campus tuition, off-campus housing situation would generally not, be within that prepaid program. So they are things that can be used together. Doesn't have to be a one or the other choice. If you live in a state where prepaid plans are popular, or if you already have one of the prepaid programs. Any thoughts there on the prepaid side of things, Roger?
Yeah, I would say that, prepaid program is kind of like, inflation insurance in a sense that, you put money in at today's price and you have that guaranteed in the future. So I think a 529 certainly has more upside potential in terms of investment returns that can do better than inflation. And, in recent years, the inflation on college expenses, it might not seem like it, but it's actually tempered a little bit in the last several years. It's not as much, it's not even necessarily as great as overall inflation in the economy. The other thing to consider is with a prepaid plan, you can get some of that money back if the child goes out of state, but it's much less attractive out of state versus in state. And so the flexibility is not as good. So yeah, I think there's a good reason why there are fewer of those plans. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. That there are a lot of good things about the savings-based plans.
Excellent. And so, kind of the flip side of our multiple accounts for multiple children, can I have multiple accounts for one child? Or can I open, a bunch of different accounts? Can we have different account owners, all contributing to this one beneficiary's education through their own 529 plans? And that's totally okay. There's no limitation on how many 529 plans you can open. I often tell the story of our founder at savingforcollege.com, Joe Hurley, opening every single 529 plan in the nation just so that he could get the information about them. So that's something that you can totally do.
Completely crazy
Um,
for most people, but yes, you can open up multiple, and yes, multiple contributors would be a reason to have multiple accounts. For one parent to have two different ones, or different states for a child feels maybe more complex than you need. And you mentioned earlier, don't overthink it with some of this stuff. But yes, multiple accounts are acceptable.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of questions around that vein. If the parents already have a 529 plan set up for the children, can the grandparents do it also? Absolutely, no problem there. All right, so here's a little bit more of a complicated one, Roger, that I will level with you. I don't have as much knowledge on, but the case of divorce in 529 plans and what happens to the assets there. And is there the question specifically, is there any way to protect all the money so it's still going towards the child instead of being split as marital assets? I don't know if you have any take on that knowledge. I know we
Yeah,
got an article about it. I can try to find for everybody real quick, but
yeah, I guess divorce rules vary by state, so I don't want to get too
I
deep into it. But I would think that, as part of your divorce settlement, you can work to maintain those accounts for the benefit of the kids. I think that certainly makes sense. I think, with thinking about financial aid for kids in a divorce situation, it's basic, generally the financial aid will be based on who's contributing more from a financial perspective to the um, support of the child. So you could do some things in terms of who has those accounts going forward, but I don't want to get too deep into that. I think you'll want to talk to divorce attorney about what what's a good approach there. I would say though, when you talk to those attorneys, do bring it up. Do make sure that the attorney isn't just taking an easy approach of, oh, just split everything equally. There are certain types of accounts that could be better off with a lower income parent and a higher income parent, and not just 529s, but there are considerations there that just splitting each account 50-50 down the middle might not be the ideal approach. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I was able to find the article that we have on savingforcollege.com about it. So if you've got some more questions around that specific instance, we've got some more information there. Just a few kind of repeat questions I want to clarify. Using the money for universities overseas, that is a possibility so long as that university accepts federal financial aid. Yearly limit on contributions. So there you are somewhat bound by the gift tax exclusion, like Roger was discussing. This year it's $19,000. If you want to go over that, you can either do a 5-year declaration where you can do 5 times $19,000, or you could actually just go ahead and dig into your lifetime gift tax exclusion if you so desire. Let's just take a look here. All right, so here's an interesting one. It's a little bit specific, but it brings up an important point that I want to hammer home one more time, because this is the one thing that I always think is so important. It sounds super complicated, 529 plans. There are 100 of them. They're all sponsored by states, right? But it's really quite simple. The one mistake that you can make is taking the distribution in the wrong year. And so there's a question here that says, this fella hasn't set up a 529 plan, but paid the granddaughter's graduate tuition, which was $16,000 for the first year. And could I take, a tax deduction on that? And so it really, again, it depends on if it was this calendar year or not. If it wasn't this calendar year, then no, you cannot do that. So just keep that in mind. And especially, it gets very complicated between the first and the second semester, right? Where your tuition bill may be due in December, may be due in January. You've got to make sure that you match that distribution with your tuition bill.
Hey, Mark, I'm seeing a question that's kind of interesting. It says there's chatter about not using your 529 plan on the first year of school. Any thoughts on this? And it's interesting, back when grandparent accounts were less favorable, there was a strategy of wait and use the grandparent accounts late in college so that that income doesn't affect one of the years in college, okay, for financial aid purposes. So there was that strategy. That no longer really is a thing, so to speak, for grandparent accounts. I'm not thinking of a great reason to not use your 529 plan assets in the first year of school. I mean, maybe just your own kind of personal account bucketing and planning to make sure the money is there later would be something. But if you're trying to kind of draw down assets that are counted against, counted for financial aid purposes later, you probably would want to draw down assets that count against your financial aid. So I don't know if do you have any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I haven't heard that chatter specifically, but the only concept I can think of is if you have a situation where the market is down. I mean, and granted, at that point, you should be moved more toward conservative investments, and you will be if you're in an age-based track. I know that there were some questions around what you should do as you get toward that distribution time. You should be moving more toward capital preservation options. But I guess if you don't have the full 4 years covered in your 529 plan and you want to give the market a year to maybe come back, that's a risk you can take. But again, that's a risk. That's a market timing question that you'd have to answer for yourself.
Yep.
Let's just see if we've got any last questions. Thanks, folks, for all the wonderful support and nice words that you're sharing in the chat. Mary, a question about using it for graduate school. Absolutely, you can do that. It's no problem at all. And with the Grad Plus loans potentially going away, might be a wise idea to start saving for grad school if that's a goal for your children. I don't know, Roger, if there are any. Okay, so there's this question here around transferring to like multiple Roth IRAs to try to get around the $35,000 limit. That's not something that I can encourage, and I don't think that that's going to.
I think you see my expression. When you start saying to get around a limit, I think we would not promote that. Yeah, I mean that transfer to a Roth is again not something you should be thinking of as a loophole or necessarily even a strategy up front. It's more, hey, if you've got some extra money and you've had this for a while, it's a nice thing to be able to do with it.
Excellent. So we are getting kind of close to the top of the hour here, folks. Okay, so there's a question that I do not recall the answer to, and maybe Roger, you have it. And I'm not remembering if maybe we're still waiting for IRS guidance on this particular piece. If a 529 plan is rolled over at some point, does that reset the 15-year requirement for the plan to be open to transfer it to a Roth IRA? I know for sure that this was something that the industry had asked for clarification on from the IRS, but I unfortunately do not recall the answer to it. Not sure.
I honestly don't know either. I mean, I would hope that wouldn't disqualify you, but again,
I'm leaning toward that way, yes. But it's certainly something, Nick, that you could just do a quick Google search and we'll find that information for you. And I do want to remind folks, because there was another question, that this webinar recording will be shared as soon as I'm able to get it up into YouTube and Zoom, recording is processed. But thank you all for joining us. It's been a fantastic session, as always, here on 529 Day in America. I want to thank Roger once again for joining us. Really, it's so informative. And of course, our presenting sponsor, the T. Rowe Price College Savings Plan, making this free webinar available for all of you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Happy 529 Day. And of course, visit savingforcollege.com for any more questions that you have. All right. Thanks,
Thanks, Mark.
everybody. Take
Thanks,
care.
Mark.